University of Chicago Center in Delhi, which provides a base for research, teaching, dialogue among scholars across the world. The center in Delhi is celebrating its 10th anniversary of pioneering many path-breaking initiatives in the areas of liberal arts and humanities, energy and environment, medical and physical sciences. This has been possible because of our incredible faculty members who remain committed to issues in India and our partners and collaborators. Today's event is a solid step in that direction. Without taking any more time, let's get into the much awaited segment of the day, that is the Fireside Chat with Professor James Heckman. Professor James Heckman is a Nobel Laureate who's presently serving as the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. Professor Heckman was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2000 for his pioneering work in the development of theory and methods used in the analysis of individual or household behavior. His work in selective samples led him to develop methods such as the famous Heckman equation and Heckman correction for overcoming statistical sample selection problems. Dr. Heckman is renowned for his research in labor economics and his profound contributions to understanding the efficacy of early childhood education programs. His work explores the origins of social and economic problems such as inequality, social mobility, and skill formation and regulation. By integrating insights from economics, psychology, genetics, epidemiology, and neuroscience, Professor Heckman's ongoing interdisciplinary research explores human development and skill formation over the life cycle and examines the origins of inequality and the determinants of social mobility across various life stages, starting from the womb. My apologies. With Professor Heckman, we have Shaveta Sharma-Kukreja, who will be in conversation. Shaveta is the CEO and Managing Director of Central Square Foundation. She has been part of the founding team of CSF since 2012. Shaveta leads CSF's work on foundational literacy and numeracy, early childhood education, and EdTech, and oversees the organization's institution building. Shaveta is on advisory boards of Language and Learning Foundation, Madhi Foundation, Sarthi Education, India Leaders for Social Sector, and founding mentor to the Udayti Foundation. Prior to CSF, she worked with Boston Consulting Group and Citibank. A very warm welcome to our guests, requesting you to kindly take this. So I would request Shaveta to felicitate Professor Heckman.
I have a tight muscle. It tightened up in the last hour, I guess. So.
You've been on the go the last 24 hours.
What's that?
You've been on the go for the last 24 hours.
No, I slept last night, so I can't. I won't claim 24 hours. But anyway, this is not serious, but I probably need to roll it out with a foam roller or something. But go ahead.
Just a little token of our appreciation.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Professor Heckman, please full of his fans. I think I was meant to say thrice that you're in a room full of fans. And thank you so much for making this time for us today. When I say fans, it's because, again, I was taking the liberty of telling Tripti ma'am that at least all NGOs and civil society organizations, when we talk about early childhood education, early learning, why work needs to start early, our presentations start with the Heckman Curve. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you everyone for making it on short notice, especially our respected government dignitaries and friends from the civil society and also the private school segment. Thank you so much for making the time on short notice. Without much ado, Professor Heckman, I think our audience would love to get to know how your journey started with early childhood education. So if you could take us back to when was the first time you got engaged with the primary schools, and how did the whole genesis of the Heckman Curve, the Heckman equation begin with the pre-primary school project?
The short story of it is the following. For a long time, I've been interested in since I was a graduate student, actually, working in human capital and skills. I mean, it's one of the basic questions in economics, how skills are acquired. And most of the early work in this area, work by Gary Becker, for example, a leading mind, a pioneer, my colleague, my late colleague, worked on looking at things like returns to education, and then work by Jacob Mincer, looking at returns to job training, post-school experience. And these were fundamental concepts in the whole notion that changed the way we think about capital and we think about investment and we think about the way that uh, human potential is created. And it was a major revolution back in the 50s, before my time. But at Chicago, people like Ted Schultz and then later Becker and Mincer, later also at Columbia, were actually able to see, instead of thinking just about capital accumulation as being a principal component of economic growth, human capital accumulation and the growth of skills. So I think that was really a very distinctive Chicago contribution to the whole field. And so I've gained real interest in this back as a graduate student at the time when Becker wasn't that well known. And I found his work very compelling. And then I was his colleague, so we got to be close and did a lot of interaction over the years. But I was at some point working a lot on the questions of discrimination, looking at questions of wage inequality, looking at labor markets in a more general way. And I got interested in the topic of how it was that job training programs, which were viewed as a major way to promote the well being of disadvantaged people, what their effectiveness was. And I worked a lot on the job training program issue later in the 1980s and early 90s. And a consistent finding, at least of the US government job training programs, was that except for women, young women in their early 20s, re entering frequently because they had children, had dropped out of the workforce, that the job training programs were not that successful. And so it looked very pessimistic to me that already by the time we were taking teenagers and people in their early 20s, that it was very difficult to kind of save or help people who were very disadvantaged. And so this was very discouraging to me. And about the same time, I did some work on something called the GED. And the name isn't so important, but the GED was a document. It actually arose from my work on job training programs. I got involved in an experiment that was launched by the Reagan administration, actually called Job Training Partnership. And the idea was to try to bring private incentives into the job training area. So I evaluated this program and I spent some time. And that included a trip to Corpus Christi, Texas, which was a site where the job training program, a site in the job training program. And then I was introduced to the GED. And the reason why I mention this is this led to some later work, which I think is actually, at least I find important. I think it's important for understanding. The GED is this program that was a remedial program for high school dropouts. And the idea was they would take a course, frequently only a month or two long, which would then certify that they were essentially the equivalents of high school graduates. And so in some sense, it was very successful in some sense, in the sense it gave people credentials that many people thought were high school credentials. But I was curious, how could you possibly get 4 years of high school education or 3 years? How could you have that in a course of a month or two? It seemed really crazy. It wasn't possible. So I started looking into this in the US data. And the thing that was interesting was, indeed, the GED students were very capable if you measured it by achievement tests, something like a PISA test. If you looked at academic achievement tests that were used, these people were very successful. If you looked at other dimensions of their lives, whether or not they were, successful in marriage, or they're successful in the job market, or they're successful in the military or not, they simply weren't successful. And they were failures. In fact, it was the case that the Army, the US Army and the Marine Corps, and many of the military services would not even accept GEDs as high school graduates because they were too violent, they were frequently unprincipled and so forth, and they lacked self-control. That's when I became aware of how limited our current certification system was. So it got me into the whole discussion of thinking, why are we using tests, which we still do? Things like PISA tests. We just heard some talks earlier today. Somebody was talking about Lamp Pritchett was talking about the low PISA scores and so forth. And I kind of wept. I said, oh, it's sad. We're still using those. And it's easy to use these scores, but they're very incomplete descriptions. And when we look at what success was, the GEDs were essentially failures, with the exception being the women. It turned out a lot of these women, in the US system was the case when a woman was pregnant, she'd be kicked out of school. And so she would literally not go to school. And once the kids were old enough, she could get a GED and re-enter college system. And she would frequently make up for the lost time. She lost a few years of work experience and so forth, but she was able, it turns out, by about age 30 to do well. So the GEDs were successful for that group. Otherwise, it was very bad. But the real lesson was not the GED, which is a small story. The real lesson was the fact that these so-called test scores, the things that we use to measure. So that tipped me onto something that was very, very important, which was that social and emotional skills were very, very important. We had indirect. So I wrote some papers, quite a few papers at the time, looking at these social and emotional skills, what we call soft skills sometimes, or non-cognitive skills. It's not that there's no cognition involved. They just aren't the kind of tests that are used according to the IQ test and so forth. So that was one line of development that got me into this. But about the same time as I was getting interested in the GED and writing on this, I was approached by a man probably many people know about. And in fact, I hear some of his names that were mentioned or his books, Charles Murray, who was writing a book on the bell curve. And he came to Chicago quite often, and I talked with him, and he saw my work on the GED and was very curious about it. So he asked me to read the book, if you read the book, and give him comments, which I did. And so we spent a fair amount of time. And I thought the book had real contribution when it looked at putting psychological measurements like the achievement tests, the AFQT test, the Armed Forces Qualifying Test, and he showed that was playing a powerful role or an important role. And so, meanwhile, I was also noticing how limited these achievement tests were. So we talked about it, and he was very resistant. And it's his book, and we talked. And in the course of writing the book, of course, his co-author, Herrnstein, died, so he took over. And we had a lot of discussions, and he wrote the book. But he came out with something very negative in some sense. He came out with the notion here of a group of people who are cognitively feeble, and he used the Armed Forces Qualifying Test as an IQ test, which it is not. And later, in some work, I found that the Armed Forces Qualifying Test score was as much dependent on social and emotional skills, the curiosity, how much people learned, as it was on IQ. So we broke that down in later work. But I thought, well, this is very discouraging. If in fact we have this system where there's a group of people who are just inherently dumb. And remember, if you read the book, Murray was talking about a reservation, putting people on the book out on the reservation because they were just cognitively too feeble. That's a very pessimistic conclusion. Well, meanwhile, by accident, literally, there was a meeting at a group down in Chicago. You know, the Chicago area has been a breeding ground for work on early childhood. And there was something called the Erickson Institute, named after the famous psychologist. I don't know if he ever literally was there, but they named this institute after. But there were people, philanthropists, people like Harris, who was Irving Harris, who was a founder of the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, and many others who were actively engaged in early childhood. And they invited had a lecture series. And I don't know why I got this, but I got a memo saying, announcement, there was going to be a speaker from Wayne State University. He was a neurosurgeon, and he was actually going to talk about the importance of early childhood and what the neurological evidence was on this. So my wife and I went there. I thought it was a very interesting seminar. Meanwhile, I was reading this work by, Murray, and I was kind of discouraged, thinking, well, we have this group of people who are dropping out and we're not going to be able to help them. This is a very negative image of what the American society would become. So anyway, to get to the point, I started realizing that maybe there was another avenue. And it turned out that Herrnstein, who was one of the co-authors of the Bell Curve, had run a program in Venezuela, an early childhood program, and had found actually very significant effects, statistically significant effects, which I found interesting. And we saw, well, look, maybe if we're tackling the problem of of disadvantaged children at the teenage years, we were starting too late. So I got interested in how far we could go going back early. And then I became aware of a whole body of research done by developmental psychologists. The Perry Preschool Project was the most prominent, but there were others as well. So I became deeply interested. I'm an economist, I'm an econometrician, I do a lot of statistical analysis. I read the papers and I started interacting with these groups. And I saw, well, some of the statistical analyses weren't all that good, to be honest. There was a lot more that could be done. So I started collaborating with this group, and I continue the collaboration to this day. In fact, a working paper just appeared from the National Bureau of Economic Research, where we summarized 50 years of research on the Perry Preschool Project. But I got very interested because I saw, look, these were disadvantaged children from the same general communities of these where the job training programs were targeted. And yet we saw real benefits in terms of boosting things like IQ, social and emotional skills, and so on. And this kind of linked in, well, here, social and emotional skills. So we started looking at that. And honestly, I don't want to overstate our contribution, but at that time, really the original proposals were launched to boost IQ. We came along and said, no, you shouldn't do this. And you should also separate the data out on the basis of gender. There are really significant effects between boys and girls, and those have been found repeatedly in these studies. So anyway, you're probably been going on too long here, but what happened is I got very interested in this business of early childhood and just read the studies, and I interacted with a lot of these scholars. And that was a very fruitful, because we went back to, oops, why are we going into the darkness here?
So
What's that?
we'll get
Oh,
it
I
right.
see,
Don't
for
worry.
cameras or something? Okay, well, whatever.
They'll take care
So
of it.
so anyway, so we had this problem of really understanding how we could really foster human development. And then I saw, aha, these early childhood programs promised to be very fruitful. But I was curious and dubious more about the evidence. So I reanalyzed all the programs myself, and we actually found, and we started contributing things that economists would bring to these, like doing cost-benefit analyses, trying to do something very significant in a sense of finding, are there real impacts? And then we organized the data longitudinally, because we had data from these children starting at 3 and 4, and now we have data on these same people age 55, and now going into their 60s. So I thought this
Actually,
was this is
specifically on that, Professor Heckman, I just wanted you to also, I think for
too long an introduction. Sorry.
no, but I think, like I said, I don't think is anyone in this room not familiar with your work, but getting the chance to hear from you is such a privilege. I think specifically talking about the Perry Preschool Project, which started in the 1960s.
Right.
And I think for most of us, the fact that it is showing intergenerational evidence,
Correct.
that when those children have grown up and become parents, the impact that it's showing over the lifetime has been so incredible. And just wanted you to specifically tease out, this whole, and you did share about it, the skills versus scores, whereas most of our tests just test for IQ, they test for scores, whether it's a PISA, versus what all of us really need to do well in life are the skills. So specifically from the evidence that came out of the Perry project, if you could share more about the skills versus scores evidence, that would be super relevant.
Exactly. But I got into this project, remember, just analyzing data that they had collected, and did this in a joint way. This was their data. This was their project. And the founder of this project, a man named David Weikart, deserves a great deal of credit. He was very much ahead of his time. What later became known as Head Start and many of these early programs really were based on his early work on Perry. And he was working long before many of these notions, even in child development, were well known. I mean, people like Piaget and Vygotsky and so forth were not really known to these people at the Perry Preschool. They did it on the basis of the intuition of what would work. But what was very interesting is they collected very rich data, and we were able to analyze that data and consistently analyze the data. But as I began to be aware of these social and emotional skills, we started going back to the records, and we could see that these people, not using standard definitions, but definitions that could translate into standard definitions, were actually collecting data on social and emotional skills. So I started asking, well, he had this enigma. Initially, it looked like the IQs had died out. There was a whole controversy. In fact, it still exists today. There was a controversy that goes back to the 1960s about the notion that from Head Start and from some of these early programs, and again, it motivated Murray and the bell curve, that we couldn't really change IQ because by age 10, it looked like the Perry
Fields were
IQ had
getting
faded
eroded,
away.
yeah.
However, what was being used were very strange IQ scores and the same tests that were used for kids 4 and 5 at age 10 and 11. So as I got into this process, we were able to find much better data, and we followed people up into the 30s and now into the 50s. And as you say, we could see their children as well. So we'd see intergenerational effects. And so going back to the early records, and this is something that's very, very interesting, and cooperating with these people, recognizing the wisdom. And I would ask you, if you're really interested in this, to download this working paper that was literally just released this morning. I just saw it on my line from the NBER. It's 50 years of experience with. But what we found was that even when you looked at the IQ measures, that the measures of IQ that were being used weren't that good. And when we measured IQ at age 55, executive functioning and the components, they were very strong. There were very strong treatment effects on people at age 55, so that the fade out wasn't there. Now, Jensen, back in the 60s, wrote this famous article. I think it was in Harvard Education Review. I've forgotten the source. Yeah, but the idea was basically there's nothing you can do. There's fade out. You have all these little dumb kids. We try to raise their IQ and it doesn't work. And that's the methodology. That guides Murray. Murray's frozen in time into the 1960s. He just doesn't want to understand. He's too old, maybe. But anyway, but the point is, no, seriously, I think, and what we did find is there was this massive increase. And here was an interesting thing. Even for these kids who were finding that they had lower IQs by this measure, it was this test which was questionable itself, those same kids were doing better in terms of achievement tests, in terms of PISA tests. And they were much more open to experience. They're much more engaged. And why was that? Because the PISA test and these achievement tests aren't just tests of raw IQ, they're tests of knowledge. And the kids who were in this program were highly motivated. So again, the so these things came together, the notion of child development, and then coming up with a richer measure of social and emotional skills. And so those two projects have just been going left and right, both moving forward. We have large projects on each, but also branching out and trying to understand what was the essence of these programs. And so in other words, why did these programs work? And as we look more deeply into the statistics, and I would argue, yes, this is due to the wisdom of the early pioneers, and I was not one of them. They were there in the 60s, and I was a graduate student or even an undergraduate when this was formed. But what they did is they collected a lot of data on social and emotional skills, and they also collected data on parenting. And what's interesting is you could see that the program, which has a component of home visits, where the teachers would visit with a parent and give them some advice and try to engage the parent. And Weichert, who founded this, was very clear. He has very clear statements, which we quote in this paper, just advertising. Basically said, what happened is the program was most successful when it engaged the parents in the life of the children. So that then got me very interested as I got more and more interested in this, saying, well, look, what is the essential ingredient? One of the aspects of these early childhood programs has been, I would call a shotgun approach. There are many components to these, and there are hundreds of papers that have the same title. It's amazing how repetitive this title is. peering into the black box, something like that. You'll see it everywhere. And you'll be tempted. Maybe you've written a paper on that. But the point is, it doesn't get to the essence of what was going on. There are a lot of things going on, which is always a problem. But then I got interested in another study, and I came through accident, but I did learn about it, and that was in Jamaica. And Jamaica has an early childhood program, but it's a stripped down version. It's a very, very cheap program. It's about a 20th of the cost of the Perry program. Very, very cheap. And what does it consist of? It consists of home visits to mothers or the caretakers. Usually they're mothers in the slums of Kingston, Jamaica. Very poor people. And the materials that the mothers are using to make books and coloring books and ways to interact with their children come from the village dump. So the whole thing is a very low budget enterprise, but it involved engaging the mother in the life of the child and engaged promoting that kind of interaction. And so what we did is I got very interested and I said, let's see what happens in Jamaica. So I started analyzing the same situation. The Jamaicans were in a situation, they had some interesting data, but they weren't econometricians. So we wrote a series of papers with them. We're still writing them. Paul Gertler and I and Rodrigo Pinto and the group in Jamaica still working on these problems. But what we found is we ended up following the Jamaican children till age 35. And it turns out, again, these kids were very young. The original program was a nutrition program. It was designed to help children who were basically, very poor nutrition, lived in bad environments. But in her wisdom, Sally Grantham McGregor, who I think received some kind of knighthood or recently in London, she's now living in London, but she lived in Jamaica for many years, received this honor. But in her wisdom, she added another arm, which was basically just visiting the mother and giving some advice about information for the children. That was all. Trying to get the parents engaged in the life of the child. And what we found was extremely interesting. And when we looked at this, they were long-term effects. And they weren't just short-term effects. One of the dangers in this whole area is people run an experiment. 6 months later, they say it worked or didn't work. That's the standard. You'll see a lot of papers published doing that. It's junk. It's junk science. You really need to know whether or not these programs last. But these programs now, we follow these kids till 35. And what again we saw, we took psychological measurements. That was true for both the Perry program and the Jamaica program. And other programs as well, a program we have in China that maybe we can talk about. But the point that I want to make, though, is that these programs, this other Jamaican program, provided a way to kind of isolate. It's kind of like a good scientist would do. You kind of isolate a chemical compound. What is the active ingredient of this compound? And so we said, what is the trajectory? What is the growth rate? How well do children in the same age range, using the same measures, so we want comparability, how well do those children do from Jamaica compared to something like Perry? And we found it amazingly comparable. So we started looking at this and said, and then later it turned out there was a program inspired by Jamaica that I was also engaged in Ireland, the slums of Dublin. Had a University College Dublin, Orla Doyle now. She has a paper published in the Journal of Political Economy and several other papers, but she has shown, similar to what the Jamaican program found, very strong effects. But and it's the same kind of program. It's a program that's encouraging the parents. It's a very low-cost program. This is even less frequent than Jamaica. It's a fortnight. Literally, they would visit a fortnight, and that was it. 1 hour. It sounds like it's impossible. But what it did do is it engaged the parent, and it got the parents actively engaged. And that turned out to be very successful. So I started to think, well, that's interesting. That's the ingredient. So we started looking more actively at parenting programs, and that launched a pile of some new work that we did in China. So I happened to be in China, and they were talking about a nutrition program, and I'd just been working on Jamaica, and I told them what we had found. And I said, you might want to think about this stimulation program and home visiting, and they did. So we now have a program. We're looking at children all over China. We ended up with programs in Tibet, but also the longest study is in Gansu. But the crucial thing is we're able, at fairly low cost, triggering the engagement of the parent. And the whole thing is interaction. And you see, that's why when I look at this literature, I don't want to be antagonistic to anybody. But one thing about the early childhood literature, I'm not the child development psychologist. I'm not. I've never claimed to. I've read a lot of the literature. I'm an economist, and I admit that I don't know everything. I've read a lot of the literature. And the one thing that was really important, I think, was getting to understand that this importance of interaction. And it wasn't the credentials of the visitor. It wasn't how clean the site was. These villages, I mean, when we went to Tibet, we were living in compounds. There were yaks out there, grazing and so on. And the same thing is true in Gansu. These people living, some of them in caves and so forth. The home visitor was visiting in the home. But the crucial thing is these people who were home visitors were people like the people being visited. They had the same education. It wasn't like there's some program that comes out of Denver, the OLDS, the Nurse Family Partnership Program. They have a whole set of franchises that make some money on it. I don't want to attack it, but they insist that all the people be trained at Denver. They all be registered nurses. They all be this, that, and the other thing. I said, well, that's fine. It's all good. You can run your own franchise. But what you really want to do is find out what is the active ingredient. And we really found it was home visiting, and we found activating the parent. It doesn't have to be home visiting. There are other ways to do it. So I don't want to pretend. I'm not offering a program. As scientists, as people trying to understand, we want to know what the ingredients are, and you build around it. What are the principles, not what is a particular program? And that's another whole development that needs to be examined, because a lot of the mentality in this literature has this notion that here we have a list of programs, and we're supposed to find the best on this list. And that's nuts. It's nuts, because most of the programs need to be adapted to a local situation, and you want to extract from those programs principles, not a particular program that's sacred or somehow. And so the literature is marred with a lot of this discussion going on, saying this program is good, this program is bad. That just diverts attention from what we're trying to get at, was what matters. My suggestion, you can do this. We see it in other environments, actually, where home visiting programs done in centers have been effective. And this, actually, the Irish program is the one I mentioned that actually has that feature. But it's engaging the parents, and there are different ways to do it. So I think what we want to do is, in investigating this, is finding the principles
Those
that lead
elements,
to human development.
I think that specifically will resonate with almost everyone in the room, that there is no one right program which needs to be taken to different geographies.
Right.
But what are the frameworks, what are the principles, and how do we put them in the context of our particular intervention? I want to double click on the whole, the skill versus score, specifically from a character skills perspective. I think a lot of your work talks about character building. You spoke about social emotional skills. I think the audience would really benefit from your articulation of what this long list or a short list is. And specifically, I'm making this very relevant to the Indian context. How do we measure it with children in a way which is safe, but also reliable?
Well, we've been engaged in that. I've been in another project I have in China, actually, in Mianzhu area of China. We have a huge sample, about 7,000 or 8,000 children. We've been following them longitudinally for the last 5 years now, I guess 6 years. But we're continuing to follow them. So we actually take very accurate measurements. Like personality measurements are very delicate things. So you get very different answers if you ask the person themselves, especially a child. You can ask a child, are you patient? I mean, what does the child even think? A young child, it's meaningless. You ask the parents are always thinking their children are really good, very positive. The best source of information is the teacher. And why do I say it's the best source? Because if you use these measures, they have the most predictive power for other behaviors that you see for the child. So it's not just that I happen to like teacher answers, it's because they actually are very predictive. So we've done a lot of work on trying to verify that. And there are ways to look at it. See, the interesting thing is it's less hard. In the Mianzhu study now, we have very rich measurements on children. So we actually are able to look at things like time preference. Literally, you can do experiments with children. You can give them choices. You can do the same thing about risk preference, risk tolerance, ambiguity aversion, people familiar with Ellsberg urns and so forth. We do that with these children, versions of it. And reciprocity, versions of altruism, negative and positive reciprocity, and so forth. And an executive functioning, there are a whole variety of scores that have been developed by psychologists, so-called Tower of London and so forth and so on. And so what you can do then is actually apply these scores and adapt them. In China, we obviously translate these scores in a Chinese context, and even skills that are uniquely Chinese. I think maybe they're also Indian, I'm not sure. But in China, there's this concept of guanxi. And guanxi is kind of getting along with others. It's not just openness. So we actually also measure guanxi. And, it's another whole project we're doing is actually showing how these social and emotional skills, these so-called soft skills, link to the so-called hard skills that economists measure. We're asking to what extent these psychological measures are really the same as risk preference, or do they add different dimensions to human experience? And we actually find they do. They're really aspects of human performance. And the one thing that really has emerged, and I talked about it earlier today in one of the sessions, is this concept of executive functioning. And this I link to the notion of agency. But the executive functioning is really important, especially in the modern world, because it's not only the ability to control oneself, to stay on task, it's working memory, it's a whole variety of things of that sort. But also it has the other feature of essentially being able to recognize problems as a whole. See, one of the things about PISA and a lot of the standard tests is you think about measuring people by, like a Raven's test. And that is telling you something about, there are versions of it, both verbal versions and more abstract mathematical versions and so forth, and pictorial versions. You have to adapt these IQ tests to children of different ages, and there's certain things that they might know they can't do at a very early age. But the point, though, is that these scores are really very, very useful in predicting a variety of behaviors. But the behaviors themselves, see, one of the things we think about, and I'm an economist, so as an economist, I go into this area of child development, and I can be like a bull in a china shop. I can just literally, I don't play by the rules of a psychologist or this, that, or the other person. So I'm the odd man out. But one thing that economists think about a lot is behavior. And we have a lot of measures on behavior. And the measures of behavior can also be used as measures of social and emotional skills if we carefully control for things like cognition and for the incentives to act in certain ways in situations. So a lot of the work in Me and Zoo now is isolating those components. So one behavior, for example, is behavior in school towards your peers. How many kids are detained? How many kids are actually dropping out or failing to go do their homework and various, these are measures. So we think of, as economists, we say, look, it's true psychologists have these measures, and I'm not belittling those, but we link those measures. They predict the behavior. We can turn around the other way. The behavior can be inverted to tell us something about these other measures. And so it's a very rich area. As an economist, it's exciting because you're really learning about all the aspects of diversity of human beings. But it's more than just an intellectual exercise, because then we can think about devising programs and measuring success. And this one notion about executive functioning, to come back to that notion, the ability to look at a problem as a whole, the ability to understand it, that's something and the ability to change and to adapt to change. Those are aspects of executive functioning that we typically don't measure. Certainly PISA scores aren't measuring those. And actually, a lot of the typical measures are not capturing those things.
Most academic assessment tests would not.
They're not. And those other components are very, very important. Angela Duckworth, I've done some work with her over the years. She talks a lot about grit. Very closely related is conscientiousness, though, a big debate about that in that literature. And that's not my debate, settling whether it's really different or not. But it certainly is predictive, grit or conscientiousness, though one or the other. And those things really do matter, how children stay on task. And so it helps explain behavior. For example, there was this one study done years ago, and they were saying, women were being discriminated against because they weren't doing as well on some dimensions, but they had better grades. Well, okay, that's interesting. But then what was being done, as is very common, is that grades were being used as a measure of cognition. But of course, grades involve a lot of motivation and conscientiousness. And it turned out that if you looked at the difference, women are more conscientious as a group. There are a lot of women, a lot of heterogeneity among women. So it's not the case that all women or all men are one thing or the other. But the fact of the matter is, as a group, they were more conscientious. And so these grades were not capturing what they claimed to be capturing. They were capturing other traits. But those traits are valuable if you look at them in the market and you look at who's showing up on time and who's doing, those are very valuable traits. And so the question is then, when we think about the workplace and we think about where we want to train people and where children can be, understanding that these traits are varied and they have multiple uses. So, for example, if we want somebody who is going to be a diamond cutter, say in Amsterdam or say Antwerp or the United States or somewhere, we might think that trust and certain aspects would be highly valuable in a way that it wouldn't be if you were working in a mine or coal mine or something, or under supervision on an assembly line. So, but even now we know, when we think about the modern assembly line, the ability to cooperate and coordinate plays a very important role. So as the technology changes and moves towards more complex functions, and as the evolution of technology changes, so one of the themes here at this conference, creative destruction, Schumpeterian theme. And that theme is also something that actually is very, very important and is captured again by aspects of this executive functioning. So we have richer measures that we didn't even think of. Certainly, there was no executive function, to my knowledge, when Perry was developed. But nonetheless, now we could measure it at age 55 because we collected data on these people at different longitudinal points.
Thank you. I've been given a time reminder, and we do want to make time for audience questions, but I wanted to ask, we almost seek your advice, very specific to our context in India right now. From an education perspective, India, almost after 3.5 decades, has come up with a new national education policy, 2020. It talks about the need for 3 years of pre-primary as a part of formal education for children. Except in our country, Professor Heckman, the 0 to 8-year age group becomes the responsibility of 2 different ministries. We have the Ministry of Women and Child Development, and we have the Ministry of Education. Children move to a formal school at 6 years of age in grade 1. Prior to that, they are in Anganwadis, which are managed by the Women and Child Development Ministry. In this context, where India wants to be very ambitious about 3 years of pre-primary, we fundamentally believe this is the future workforce for the developed nation that India wants to become. What would be 2 or 3 specific advice from your perspective to our policymakers in this context of where we are with our education journey?
Well, years ago, I went to Argentina with a former student and 2 former students, actually. One who was a minister of fiscal equity in the Menem government. We went back recently to Buenos Aires because some of our ideas were accepted. But the idea that we want to say is you don't really want to break things up into 2 or 3 ministries. We were suggesting the idea of something like a ministry of human capital, something that represents the fact that when you think about some of the aspects, that when you look at the multiple benefits, you're looking at things, for example, like reduced crime, enhanced health, greater education, and so forth. And so one of the mistakes in this area is to break things up too narrowly and to not recognize the synergies across these areas. And this is a big fallacy that it comes, I think, most of us are subject to this. We say, oh, and this, even when you talked about grit a minute ago, there's a whole literature about changing interventions to promote grit. Say, just take that as an example, published papers. Well, it turns out that the Jamaican intervention promoted grit, but that wasn't at all the nature of there was no grit curriculum. There wasn't like, here you must learn grit. It was this nature of the interaction, and that's what people are missing, that there's something that's more pervasive. It has to do with interacting.
Cross-cutting.
Cross-cutting.
Yeah.
But it's cross-cutting in a fundamental way. And so this is where we're not fully sure of how all these lessons are learned. But it is the case. For example, I'll give you a totally different example. In Germany, there's a study done by Doman and Falk and others at Bonn. And the study that they do there is called Ballou and Do. The name is not important. But what it is that these are college students taking disadvantaged adolescents now, these are later stage life, and basically interacting with them a few hours a week, maybe an hour a week, and then following these interventions. They're randomly assigned. And there's something similar that was done in Germany by Ernst Fehr and his Fehr is at Zurich, but his co-author is at Mainz, who's in Germany proper. And what we found is these kinds of interventions produced a whole range of behaviors that people didn't expect. For example, like the much enhanced honesty. There are tests of honesty, how people are telling the truth. There's another test, for example, of reliability. But so what happens then is the children, because of these interactions, gain through imitation, through example, a lot of life examples, which are not like a formal curriculum. So there's a bias towards thinking we need a curriculum for everything we do. It's not true. What you need is a parent. You need some kind of interaction. And if you stimulate that one way or the other, and I'm not saying there's only one way to do it. I think we're in the middle of understanding the best way to do it. When we do that, then I honestly believe that you get a range of outcomes. But then going back to your ministry question, you realize, well, if you have that, then the minister of human capital, well, wait, you have a health ministry issue, you have a criminal ministry, all these different ministries. So how do you prevent crime? The one thing that we learned about criminal activity and it's been found repeatedly in other studies, and it wasn't my finding, it was Terry Moffat and Terry Moffat, he's a criminologist and psychologist at Duke and at University College London. And one thing she found is that the onset of serious criminal behavior, career criminal trajectories, could be detected at ages 3 and 4. Just turned out to be the age that Perry was targeting, but not with any knowledge in advance that was true. And of course, when you looked at what Perry did, it reduced criminal activity tremendously. And one of the big benefits was the reduction of felony crime and a number of arrests and so forth, murders and so forth. And so we think about it, we have to think more globally about human development. And it's not so much, I don't know the ministries in India at all, but I think you'd really want to try to build at least a unified vision. And that started happening in the United States. When Obama, the last part of the Obama administration, the Department of Labor and the Department of Health and Human Services collaborated in trying to produce programs that really recognize this multiplicity of outcomes. But more of that could be done. And I think that would represent something that would be quite useful. So right now, on paper, the Argentine government is new. I'm not sure they're going to be able to really synthesize all these different functions in one department. But you can see the idea. But it gets to a deeper understanding of how humans' skills and motives are acquired, how they're accumulated. And understanding that, I think, is really important.
And how they progress through the lifetime.
They do it in coordinating it. So the typical thing to do is like, should we have a problem, we cure that problem. So we want lower crime, we hire police. We reduce health to produce better health, we build hospitals. None of that's bad. But it also turns out that some of these activities that we're talking about, even though it sounds crazy initially, have huge effects in those other areas. And so we think about social policy, we want to think of it in a broader area that where we recognize this kind of broad range of activities. So what it does for the shape of bureaucracies in India, I cannot say, but I would say they should recognize the cross-cutting nature of their activities and the fact that there are real complementarities, synergies, if you want to use that term.
And I think that's fortunately the policy context for us is that the new education policy has set up that unified vision. We are fortunate that today India's leading policy document for education actually sets that unified vision for all age groups together. Professor Heckman, thank you so much for, as always, being very insightful. I think we've all gained so much from having read your work, but the privilege of having you in person with us